Secondly, we have, I think will be a very interesting talk from Brian O'Keefe. Brother Brian O'Keefe is actually a CUPE representative on one of the boards that oversees the governance of OMERS, this Municipal School Board Workers' Pension Plan that, as I say, has been implicated in some of these things. So he's offered to give us some remarks on that and his perspective on how this has unfolded in recent years.
Actually, Kevin, I'm not going to specifically speak on the OMERS issue. I'm going to introduce a qualification to start off with. As you know, I'm on the board of the OMERS Sponsors Corporation, and defined benefit plans are under attack right now. And OMERS is a key defined benefit plan in this country. And I don't want to add fuel I'm not here to give a critique of OMERS. I don't want to add fuel to the fire undermining defined benefit plans in this country. It doesn't make any sense. So the comments I'm going to make are going to be of a somewhat general nature. Why I'm opposed to 3Ps, P3s. And I'm going to try to be, not to be repetitious in relation to a lot of the stuff you've done, but some of it is unavoidable. The context is very, very important of how P3s developed, and also the definition, I think, is really important. Just to backtrack a little bit on the development of P3s. Relationships between government and the private sector are nothing new. That's been around for a long time. But P3s are a relatively new concept. And we first see P3s to any great extent developing in the UK in the early 1990s. It started with the John Major government in the UK, which followed the Thatcher government. And it's interesting that the 1980s was one period of outright privatization. That was the period when Thatcher privatized large tracts of the UK economy. It was only later on that we see the evolution of the P3 concept, and I think that's important, and the reasons why it started, I think, in the 1990s, and it spread very quickly to Canada. The Canadian Council on Public-Private Partnerships was founded in 1993, and the first real P3 in Canada is probably the Confederation Bridge project in PEI, which the construction started in 1992 and was completed in 1997. You're right, Kevin, the Nova Scotia schools was pretty close at hand, and it's no secret that Borealis was involved in both of those projects. So that, and then the whole evolution of P3s developed leaps and bounds from that. But I think, getting back to the 1990s again, I think that period in our history is very, very important. That was the period when the book Reinventing Government came out. That came out in 1992, and that mirrored and reinforced the thinking in government circles during that period. And it was all centered around introducing market principles into the public sector, and making a distinction between policy development and the delivery and operation of services, and making the argument that in many cases that the delivery of services should be delivered outside the public services. It's something that we quarreled from the word go, and we still totally object to that. Yeah. Now, it's important that the two main drivers of P3s at that particular point in time was clearly the key one was privatization. I think really that's what we're all concerned about here. It's the dismantling of the public sector, outright privatization, because it's just privatization under another name. But the second aspect at this time was somehow or other governments saw this as a way of avoiding avoiding debt. This was a convenient way of getting debt off the public accounts. And the classic example of that was this was a clear policy direction that they had in the UK. And some of you will probably recall that Gordon Brown, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Blair's government, was reprimanded by the International Monetary Fund for doing that in the UK. And it sort of developed from there. This whole idea is illusory. The accounting standards globally have changed pretty dramatically in recent years. Most jurisdictions now are under international financial reporting standards, and there's no way you can get around this issue of taking debt off the public accounts. Although that doesn't mean that various different governments won't try to get around this in some way or other. There's back-end loading of the contracts, and there are many different devices to try and do it. But the reality is it's very, very difficult to do it now with the new international financial reporting standards. The definitional piece is really important. I know Natalie has talked about it, but infrastructure as an asset class is very prevalent in the pension fund industry. And I want to make it clear that infrastructure is much bigger than P3s. It's a very important point, because not everything is a P3. And secondly, not all P3s actually are outright privatization. And there's the whole issue of where you draw the line about what's in the public sector and what isn't in the public sector. And then the UK is a very good example where large swaths of the economy were privatized, and a lot of these parts of the economy are up for grabs. And the question is it legitimate to buy into these projects, or just leave them alone? So I think there's some delicate issues that people have got to take into consideration here around the whole privatization piece. And I think really what's really key here, and we've got to bear it in mind at all times, is the fact that this is all about privatization, and that should be front and center and why we're opposed to these projects in one form or another. So on a definitional point of view again, I know you put them up there on the slide, but there really is three main types of project here. One is the design build.
Yeah.
That's the first one. The second one is that's a design build project. Then there's design build finance project. And then the third one is design build operate and maintain. Now the first one, let's be realistic here. That's been around for years, many years, and it's tied into traditional procurement methods for roads, buildings, and bridges, and that sort of thing. It's not new. What is new, and I agree with Natalie, is the whole financing piece, which is the second one, and that is definitely one of the big developments of the 1990s. But the one that's most concerning, and the biggest issue for us, is the design, build, finance, and operate, which takes a part of the economy right out of the public sector. There are two main arguments that the P3 community are making in order to justify these projects. One is a budgetary issue, and it centers around the whole idea that there's a huge infrastructure gap. And I agree, there is a huge infrastructure gap which has been growing in Canada since the late 1990s. But that government budgets are constrained, and they have to resort to private sector financing because of this. And they've got to find a way of getting debt off their books. It's the same old same old argument that I discussed earlier around getting debt off the public books. This is an illusory argument, and you've got to, no matter what way you look at this, whether it's a lease, whatever way it's structured, it could be a concession or it could be a reverse lease or whatever. It's still got to be accounted for, and if the international financial reporting standards are what they are, it's got to appear on the public accounts. So this argument is bogus. It doesn't have any weight, and I think the proponents of P3s are using that argument less now than they did in the past. So it's the other argument is centered around the whole notion that somehow or other that P3s are more cost effective than what would be done under traditional procurement methods in the public sector. They're using what they call value for money analysis. These value for money calculations are also to a very large extent bogus. They're using very shaky accounting procedures in order to justify them. There are two basic components. So just to backtrack a little bit here, really what we're talking about here is discounting the lifetime costs of a project to its present value and comparing that present value to a public sector comparator. And if the P3 project is more cost effective than the public sector comparator, the P3 is the preferred choice. But the deck is usually stacked in this particular calculation, and almost invariably the P3 comes out ahead. Now, the components of that calculation are divided into two main parts. One is the basic costs, which are the transaction costs, legal costs, or whatever. And almost invariably in all these calculations, the P3 project is considerably more costly than the public sector comparator. To give you an example, in the big flagship P3 project in the UK, which is the renovation and maintenance of the London Underground, billion dollar project. The fees for that project alone were £500 million sterling. Absolutely phenomenal. So these are the transaction costs in these projects are enormously costly. And there's no, it comes out in the calculations. There's no dispute regarding that. But where they are able to juggle the cost differences around what's known as risk transfer. So somehow or other, all the risk involved in these projects is transferred from the public sector over to the private sector. At least that's the argument.
That's the argument.
And it is heavily focused on the construction and the pre-construction costs of all these projects. And it centers around delivering projects on time and within budget. There was a big general study, some of you are probably familiar with it. It was reported widely in The Economist magazine, produced by the UK Treasury. The projects in the UK won out based on this way of calculating the benefits of P3s. And fortunately, some of you are probably fairly familiar with this as well. Alison Pollock, who's a well-known economist in the UK, did a superb job in doing a big demolition job on that Treasury document. And there's a whole lot of juggling that took place with discount rates. In the John Loxley article, it's quite interesting. He indicates that those discount rates can be anywhere from between 10% and 3.5%. And the higher your discount rate, the less costly their project is. So if you've got a high discount rate, the chances are that your project is going to come out on top. This is nonsense. It's not true. As has been pointed out by Natalie, and pointed out by many others, these projects are very costly. They're very, very expensive. So from a public policy point of view, there are huge issues centered around that particular point. Now, but there's a whole lot of issues that are not even taken into account, or at least given very little consideration in these value for money calculations. And to name a few, around the whole issue around flexibility of government, and secondly, around the monitoring of contracts, and thirdly, around the whole issue of transparency and accountability. Just to talk a little bit around the flexibility issue. You're talking about being locked into long lease contracts here, 30 years or more. I mean, the Highway 407 ETR contract is actually for 99 years. So governments are locked in, despite what may occur during the interim. To give you an example of what this means in a project, the London Underground issue again, that particular project, the main consortium that looked after 2/3 of the project went bankrupt in 2007. The government had to take it. The UK government had to take it over. It cost them 400 million sterling, and eventually they woke up in 2010, and they actually took the rest of the project in house, costing another over, I think it was about 350 million sterling. So you're talking about approaching a cost overrun of close to $1 billion for the UK government. These are the sort of issues that are at stake when you get tied into these long contracts. I just mentioned that John Loxley's Article 2 mentions an issue around a number of schools. There were part of 3 schools that were part of a P3 project. The actual schools closed, but they were still stuck with a 35-year lease. So this is a big issue, being tied in for a huge number of years. Now, I know you want me to wind up here, so I'm going to try and be fairly quick. On the issue of monitoring of contracts, what I'm getting at there is you can't just hand a project over to the private sector without monitoring it. And that huge cost is not taken into consideration. And a lot of these P3 projects have had huge erosion of public service, an indiscriminate slashing of jobs and wages in many projects. One, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but if I had more time I would, but the Hamilton Water Treatment Plant is an obvious example. They said they were going to create a whole lot of jobs, and they actually slashed a whole lot of jobs, and they put 180 million litres of raw sewage into Hamilton Harbour. On the transparency and secrecy issue, transparency and accountability issue, the Brampton Hospital is an obvious example. I was hoping Natalie would have addressed that, but the Health Coalition and QP and OPSU and SEIU spent 4 years trying to get the documents for that project, and they eventually had to go to court to get the documents. So this is the background. So the question, this is very pertinent. The question is, why do pension plans invest in what appears to be a very questionable public policy? There are 2 reasons. One, pension plans see this as a very good alternative, for better or worse, to the volatility of current equity markets. There's a huge amount of volatility in equity markets right now, and the prognosis for the future is not great based on the current economic projections. So that's why heavily investing in private markets, particularly investments like infrastructure, are seen as a way out. The second issue is these are seen as very lucrative investments, and there's no question about it. They are very lucrative investments, but they're also seen to be at fairly low risk. Now this sticks out like a sore thumb. So somebody's not telling the true story about risk.
Who has the risk?
The P3 proponents are saying that it's low risk, and in fairness to them, they're lawyered up to the hilt. But the government is also saying they're transferring the risk over to the private sector. So somebody's not giving the straight goods here. And in actual fact, these are extremely risky. And I have no problem in saying that. How could I've been through, I've given you the flavor of the the effective public policy that's involved here. How could that not be risky? And that is why you can continue to expect, particularly public sector unions, but the trade union movement, progressive forces in Canada and elsewhere, to continue opposition to these projects, which are very defective from a public policy point of view and erode public finances. That will continue, and I think even to the point of legal intervention. I mean, this has happened in the past. QP&CEP took a lawsuit against the provincial government around the privatization of Hydro One, and that lawsuit was won. And you can expect more of that, but activity on the ground, you can expect that to happen as well, and it must happen. For those of us in this room and elsewhere, the general public, what's required is for people to stand up here, and that brings me to the next possible effect of this, and that is that hopefully sooner or later some governments will come to the senses on this issue and realize that this is very defective public policy, results in the dismantling of the public sector, and also doesn't do anything to address the public purse. So it will continue, and the battle, the jury is out on whether governments will come to their senses or not, but the only way that that will happen in the future is if the general public and progressive forces in society stand up and counter it. And as far as trustees are concerned, or directors of pension plans are concerned, I think it's a very sound argument that these P3s are not in the financial best interests of plan members. This is extremely questionable public policy, and to think that it would be less than risky would be a serious error. And that taking a position of that kind is a perfectly legitimate fiduciary exercise of fiduciary duty. I have no problem in saying that. These projects are very questionable. We need to oppose them and to continue to oppose them. There are many other types of investments that we can do and take in the general pension industry. And I acknowledge that infrastructure is a huge issue, and we've got to find a way of addressing that infrastructure gap. I think that's the way the economy needs to go in the foreseeable future, but not through P3s.
Very good.